Welcome to the Climate Report. This is Hart Hagen, and I'm your host. We're on Forward Radio, WFMP FM Louisville. This is episode 12, and today we're going to talk about what values do we want our government to embody or exemplify. But first, this is Forward Radio. We are listener-supported radio. The value and benefit to you is that we are not supported by corporate sponsors. Therefore, we are not beholden to corporate sponsors. Therefore, unlike all of your major media outlets, they have to be careful with what they say lest they offend their corporate sponsors. But we don't have to. We can say what we want, and that's important in a world that is literally owned by corporations. So I want you to go to forwardradio.org, click on donate, see if you can give an amount of $20, $30, $40 one-time donation or $5 to $10 per month, and that will help listener-supported radio stay on the air. So if this is the Climate Report, the purpose of the show is to talk about climate change with an eye towards solving the problem of climate change. So on this show, it's like, can we talk about all of these wars that America keeps getting into? Can we talk about whether these wars are remotely justified? And how does that connect to climate change? Well, for one thing, the Pentagon is the world's largest user of fossil fuels. The Pentagon is the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, which is the main culprit, the main greenhouse gas, the main problem when we're talking about climate change. So if we want to solve climate change, doesn't it make sense that we should reduce the impact of the world's largest user of fossil fuels, the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide? Surely it does make sense, especially in light of the fact that most of what the Pentagon does is not justified. Morally, ethically, legally, economically, most of what the Pentagon does is not justified. Another way and another reason why climate change is connected to the issue of war and peace is that solving the problem of climate change is going to take attitudes and practices that are utterly, completely, and entirely inconsistent with our current emphasis on solving all of our problems through war. So in order to solve the climate crisis, we're going to need much more peace, we're going to need much less war, we're going to need much less spending on defense, we're going to need much less of an arms race going on, because when we're building up our arms, then other countries feel like they have to respond by building up their arms just to defend themselves. And so what do we need to do as a people to get to the place where we need to be? One thing we need to do is we must learn our true history, and I can tell you, as sure as I'm sitting here, that the history we learned in school is not our true history. And I can also tell you, as sure as I'm sitting here, that the spin on history and the spin on current events that we get through the mainstream news media is not the truth about what really happens, because the mainstream media does two things. One thing, they make mountains out of molehills, and they make molehills out of mountains. The things that are really, really, really important that we should be looking at, they're not talking about. And the other things that are relatively trivial, they're making this big, huge circus out of, like recently the Kavanaugh hearings. I'm not saying the Kavanaugh hearings weren't important, but it's a relatively small thing that they're making into a relatively big thing. Meanwhile, there are all these issues that we could talk about where we could make a difference, and the mainstream media is not talking about it, not educating us about it. So we need to learn true history, and we're not going to get it from the mainstream media. Another thing, in order to get to the place where we need to be, we must learn the reality behind our current government. And mainly that means we must know what is the power behind the throne. On the one hand, we know that that politics is awash in money, but we don't know, we meaning the average American citizen does not know the extent to which our government is completely and entirely sold out to corporate interests. We need to know that. We need to understand the problem, because awareness of a problem is half the solution. If we're not aware of the true nature of the problem, we cannot ever hope to solve the problem. If we're not aware of the true nature of the power structure in American society, we can never hope to actually change it for the better. So we have to understand the true nature of our government and our society and our history in order to make changes for the better. And in order to do that, we're going to look just for a few minutes here at myth versus reality in America. What are some of the prevailing myths that are so deeply embedded in people's beliefs, and people really believe this stuff? Okay, so people really believe that there's an invisible hand, the free market economics. And there's no time to go into this, but free market economics has never really been true. The people who want you to believe in free market economics are the people that don't believe it themselves. The super rich are super good at feeding at the government trough, whether it's the big banks, whether it's the defense contractors, whether it's the oil companies, whether it's big retail, whether it's agribusiness. The super rich are great at feeding at the government trough, but meanwhile they're telling the rest of us, the small guy and the medium-sized guy, they're telling us that we need to believe in the free market, that it's all about competition. And people really believe that stuff, and it is deeply embedded, and it's something that we have to look at from another angle if we're going to make important and vital changes. Another thing, people believe that it's every man for himself, that, you know, people have a much greater emphasis on competition than on what's called solidarity. Solidarity is the radical notion that you ought to care about somebody, even if they're not in your family and even if they're not in your church. That we should care for the kid who's going to school, even if we don't have kids in school. That we should care for the widow on Social Security, even if she's not in our family or in our church. But people believe this is deeply embedded, especially on the right end of the political spectrum, but I would say all of us have been infected by this false notion that success in life and a successful society is where it's every man for himself. Another false belief is that government is inefficient. Okay, so, you know, as if government is less efficient than big corporations. Or even some medium-sized businesses. But government is inefficient. Let's look at that for just a minute. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that Medicare, that the administrative costs associated with Medicare are 3%. And let's say the administrative costs associated with private health insurance are 25%. If those figures are true, if those figures are false, then correct me. But if they're anywhere close to being true, we're looking at a situation where government is much more efficient than private delivery of services. When it comes to government ownership of utilities, publicly owned utilities can be much more efficient than privately owned utilities, because with privately owned utilities, they want to suck everything out in profits. They want to spend as little as possible. They want to make as much as possible. Government-owned schools can be more efficient than private schools. Let's look at pensions. Social Security is a publicly administered pension fund. The administrative costs are negligible. They're nil. Administrative costs are 1%, whereas administrative costs associated with private pension plans are much higher. I've heard figures like 13 to 14%. Maybe those figures are wrong. If those figures are wrong, correct me, but we need to ask the question, are private pensions or public pensions more efficient? We hear over and over and over that government is inefficient, and that's just rhetoric, that's just bombast, that's just blowing smoke. I'm not saying give every Okay, so here's another false belief. It's that, okay, so when the U.S. military kills and tortures people, it really means well. And besides, we need a strong defense because weakness is provocative. And you can only have peace through strength, right? That's why we pay $1 trillion or more per year in defense, which is not really defense. There's just so many false beliefs that are embedded in the militarism that we have in America. And we need all that money to be spent on transitioning to a clean economy, clean energy, renewables, etc. Here's another set of false beliefs. People actually believe that we meaning our military, that our military was justified in going into Iraq. That somehow that was justified. Somehow morally, ethically, legally, economically, that was justified. People believe that it's okay that 1 million Iraqis are dead now because we decided to roll into Iraq when the rest of the world wanted us to negotiate a peaceful settlement. And, Bush and Cheney, weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. Well, oops, didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, but we're restoring peace, democracy, and freedom. We're restoring democracy and freedom as if they needed us to give them democracy. So we roll in and kill 1 million people. Oops, sorry. So people believe we were justified in that. People, by the same token, people actually believe we were justified in going into Vietnam. Oops, sorry. 3 million people are dead in Southeast Asia now because of that. But we really meant well. And besides, there was this monolithic and ruthless conspiracy called communism. And the Soviet Union and China were all, just plotting to overthrow our entire society. And people actually believe that. I interact with people online and offline who believe that, well, we needed to go into Vietnam because North Vietnam was communist and we were helping South Vietnam. We were protecting South Vietnam. Okay, so we were protecting South Vietnam. That's why 3 times as many South Vietnamese died as North Vietnamese. That's why there's 4 to 5 times as many birth defects due to Agent Orange in South Vietnam as North Vietnam. But all this was justified. All this was, well, you have to fight communism. You have to fight our enemies, because if we don't fight our enemies, they're going to come over and kill us. People actually believe this stuff. It sounds ridiculous when you say it, but people believe this stuff. So many false beliefs need to change if we're going to convert from war to peace so we can survive the climate crisis. I could say similar stories about Afghanistan. 200,000 people in Afghanistan are dead now because we went in there illegally after 9/11 and we said, we're going to go get Osama bin Laden. There were people that wanted to cooperate with us to apprehend Osama bin Laden, give him a trial, But no, that's not how the U.S. operates. We went in there under false pretenses. Uh, we could even talk about a speech that President George W. Bush gave on October 12th, 2001, when American troops were going into Afghanistan. The speech that he gave absolutely verifies and validated that we were practicing terrorism on them. Terrorism is not just what the other guy does to us, or it's not what just terrorism is not always what somebody else does. We've defined it that way. Whenever the media talks about terrorists, they're not talking about the U.S. military. They're not talking about Israel. They're not talking about any of our client states, all over Latin America or the Middle East. They're not talking about Saudi Arabia. So terrorism is always what the other guy does. The difference is that our terrorism killed 200,000 people in Afghanistan, and their terrorism killed 3,000 people. And so we're going in there and we're bombing civilians, women, children, old men, young boys, because we feel justified in doing that. It is absolutely insane and ludicrous. I think you might know by this point how I feel about it. But what if there is a better way? So at the top of the show, I said something like what's the title of the show? What values do we want our government to embody and reflect? So, there are people, let me tell you a secret. There are people in this world who want you to believe that foreign affairs and foreign policy is complicated. Be careful of those people, because they want you to just leave it to the experts. Oh, it's so complicated. You ever ask a friend of yours like how their relationship is going, and they say, it's complicated. Maybe it is complicated. Maybe it's none of your business. Or maybe it's pretty simple and they just don't want to talk about it. When people say something is complicated, they don't want you to talk about it. They don't want you to think about it. But actually, foreign policy at its very root is very simple. Here's the simplicity. We are allowed to use military force if we are defending ourselves. Period. End of story. So that's a simple value, a simple principle, and if we want to save the planet, we need to get back to basics like that. Let me read you a list of principles and objectives of the U.S. Peace Council. And these principles and objectives are going to be reflective of good values, and they're going to be reflective of solid, sound principles in law. So here are the principles and objectives, the guiding principles and objectives of the U.S. Peace Council are: number one, prohibition of all weapons of mass destruction and ending of the arms drive. So let's talk about weapons of mass destruction. That means mainly nuclear weapons. Recently, President Obama and President Trump are wanting to build up nuclear weapons. That is insane. Nuclear weapons have never made us more secure. They have only made us less secure. Nuclear weapons are good for one group of people and one group of people only, and that's those who make money with nuclear weapons. Let me tell you another secret about nuclear weapons, and that is the nuclear weapons buildup occurred mainly in the Cold War. This fake phony, ludicrous, false war that occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I'll tell you, based on my study of history, 99 times out of 100, almost categorically, it's the United States provoking Russia, not Russia provoking the United States. Russia had no reason to provoke the United States. They had every reason just to want to defend themselves. We were always 10 steps ahead of them in the arms race. The arms race occurred because of us. Presidents Kennedy and Reagan were two examples of Truman, Kennedy, and Reagan. Three presidents that categorically dismissed any offer of disarmament from the Russians, which is insane. All the money we could save and all the additional security we could have if we would disarm nuclear weapons. So that's principle one of the U.S. Peace Council. Next, abolition of foreign military bases. The United States has approximately 800, 900, 1,000 military bases around the world. We don't know exactly how many, but it's somewhere upwards of 800 to 1,000. It is an embarrassment. These bases are quite often an ecological disaster. The soldiers I know most soldiers are good people, but a few bad soldiers on these bases commit crimes against the civilian population, and there's hardly anything the civilians can do about it. We need to abolish foreign military bases. Imagine, if you will, if Russia had a base, off of, I don't know, name an island, Cuba. I mean, I don't want to confuse the issue, because that actually did happen, or actually, we wouldn't think of allowing the Soviet Union to have a military base on Cuba, and yet we have military bases all around the world, right on the front doorstep of every other country. It is there's no reason for it. It costs a bunch of money. It is provocative. It causes arms buildup. It causes every other country in the world to want to defend themselves against us. The foreign military bases need to be eliminated. The only valid reason for military action is self-defense. Next principle, total and universal disarmament under effective international control. Let's skip that one. Elimination of all forms of colonialism and neocolonialism. Okay, so, colonialism means you've got an empire. The United States is the biggest empire that has ever existed. We don't see ourselves as an empire. In school, we're not taught that we're an empire, but we are the biggest empire that has ever existed. For one thing, we have puppet regimes all throughout Latin America and all throughout the Middle East. Latin America, don't get me started, but the Middle East, Iraq, we conquered Iraq and turned it into a colony. We absolutely control and run Iraq right now. It's not because of democracy and freedom. It's not because Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, because he was a bad guy before we decided to conquer the country. Don't get me started on how many years Saddam Hussein was an ally of the United States. He was hunted down for no other reason other than he was disobedient. Some people say, well, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Well, we continue to support how many dozens of bad guys throughout the world. We would much rather deal with a brutal right-wing military or a brutal right-wing dictatorship. How many times in history have we gone in and replaced a democratically elected government with a brutal dictator? Not least of all in Iraq. There was a time in the 50s when Iraq had a popularly elected government. We went in there and replaced it with a brutal dictator. I don't know if Saddam Hussein was the first brutal dictator, but Iran, we replaced a popularly elected government with a brutal dictatorship. In Chile, in Nicaragua, in Panama, in El Salvador, uh, Haiti. We could go on and on about how we are the puppeteers pulling the strings and making sure that throughout the world, Indonesia is another place. Vietnam, the South Vietnamese regime was a brutal fascist dictator. We could go on and on, but this is colonialism. We're talking about colonialism. Next principle in the U.S. Peace Council's principles and objectives: respect for the rights of peoples to sovereignty and independence. Okay, sovereignty. And next principle: respect of the territorial integrity of states. The world would be a different place. The United States of America would be a different place if the United States would have respect for the territorial integrity of other countries. How many countries are there in the world? It's easier to name the list of countries whose territorial integrity we have respected than the ones we haven't. All throughout Latin America, all throughout the Middle East, all throughout Africa, all throughout Southeast Asia, we have not respected the territorial integrity. Whenever we do a regime change, that's not respecting their territorial integrity. Whenever we have the Marines or other military come in, whenever we have the CIA crawling all over these countries, we are not respecting their territorial integrity. And it has nothing to do with defending the average American. It has everything to do with promoting the interest of a few wealthy oligarchs. Next principle: non-interference in the internal affairs of nations. That's just what I was talking about. The right-wing powers that be in America love to hate Venezuela. And because it's one of the half-dozen countries in the world that is trying to assert its independence from the United States. The United States hates countries that pretend to be independent of the United States. That explains the Cold War. That explains so many things. But somehow Americans feel entitled to roll into these other countries and change their governments and support right-wing dictatorships, and at the great expense of the people of those countries. So much, the untold story is how much starvation goes on in the world because of our meddling in the affairs of other countries, supporting wealthy business interests instead of leaving them alone, letting the people of that country manage the governmental affairs of that country. Two more principles to go, maybe three. Peaceful coexistence between states with different political systems. There would not have been a Cold War if we could have peacefully coexisted with states that have different political systems. The so-called communists were never a threat to us. We made them a threat because of being so darn provocative, but that was just a big fraud against the American people to get us to pay for war and war materials and military buildup that we never would have paid for if we had known the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation was that the Russians were never a threat to us. We would have so much more of a peaceful society and a more productive world if we could get in the mindset of not seeing an enemy around every corner, but there are vested interests in this country that want us to believe that there's a boogeyman under our bed and there's, you have to create an enemy. So that's about all we have time for. Thank you for joining me on the the climate report. This is Hart. Remember to support listener-supported radio, WFMP-FM, at forwardradio.org. Thank you.